Hello all out there in YouTube, and welcome to Horror Talk, where I talk about horror. I don't have an intro for these kinds of videos. Anyway, yes, so if you're new to my channel, this is the show I like to do, where it's a little less polished than my usual reviews, a little more relaxed, where I just kind of talk off the top of my head on a specific topic of horror. And if you can tell by the title of this video, we're looking at Vampires and Werewolves. The reason I wanted to talk about this is because, if you've noticed, a friend of mine gave me a haircut. She gave me a slight trimming because I was looking very bushy, and she usually cuts dog hair. But I think for her first human trimming, she didn't do a bad job. And I thought, hey, you know who else has bad hair days? Werewolves. Okay, that's a lie, but I thought it would be an amusing little opening to this video. But in all seriousness, to my friend Emily, thank you for giving me the trimming so that I can wake up in the middle of the night without bangs in my eyes. I've been wanting to talk about the topic of vampires and werewolves for about a month or so now, because I've always been fascinated by people's fascination with werewolves and vampires. When it comes to horror, you have the slasher films that everybody loves. You have, like, the supernatural movies. But when it comes to monster movies, the ones that stick out the most and the ones that fans are drawn to the most are vampire movies, werewolf movies, and zombie movies. We can put zombie movies in that category, but we will be focusing on vampires and werewolves here. But for the sake of what I'm about to talk about here, let's look at vampires, werewolves, and zombies. Let's put zombies into that category too. Because these three creatures, people seem to be drawn to them when it comes to horror movies. I mean, you think of monsters. When you're not thinking of ghosts or slasher movies, when you're thinking, monsters in horror movies, those are the three that come up the most. Vampires, werewolves, and zombies. I think the reason that these three creatures are so popular is because all three of them have a set lore to them. They have each one of them has rules and guidelines that horror fans and audiences can attach to easily. When something has a set of rules, when a character in fiction, whether it be a villain, a hero, or whatever, when they have a set of rules, when they have when the audience knows how they work, it can be easier to attach to that said character. I mean, it's good to leave certain things vague, but when there is a set guideline to that creature, audiences can attach to that more. And when that is put into movies and people go into these movies, they know what to expect. Like, for example, all three of these, vampires, werewolves, zombies, all three of them are undead. All three of them can be considered immortal in one way or another. And each one has their own set characteristics. You have zombies, they are slow, they're not too smart, but there's so many of them, and they need to eat human flesh. They may not have to eat human flesh, but there is an uncontrollable urge to eat human flesh. Vampires. They have fangs, they're pale, they drink blood, they're very strong, and they can only come out at night. You have werewolves. They have the typical wolf-esque figures, but they look like a normal human until the full moon comes up, and then they transform into this wolf-ish monster. Each one has a set weakness, or set weaknesses. Like zombies, they can only be killed if you destroy the brain. Werewolves, it varies sometimes, but it's usually silver bullets or silver can kill a werewolf. Sometimes decapitation is put in there too, but most of the time, silver bullets kill a werewolf. Vampires, they can be killed by sunlight, impaling them in the heart, like destroying the heart, or again, decapitation. Fire works too for vampires, but I think fire works for anything in certain regards. There are exceptions, of course, but usually when going into a movie involving one of these creatures, you know you're going to get at least some of those characteristics. So You go into a zombie film, you know what you're going to get. Werewolf movie, you know what you're going to get. Vampire movie, you know what you're going to get. And I think that's why it's easy for, horror fans to attach to these creatures. It's kind of the same with slasher movies. An audience knows what they're going to get when they go into a slasher film. They know they're going to get a body count, breasts, blood, all that good stuff. Now, taking zombies out of the equation, let's focus on vampires and werewolves. It's always, we can love both. Horror fans can love both of them. But usually people pick a side like, oh, I prefer vampire movies over werewolf movies. I'm one of the people who actually likes werewolves more than vampires. I'm a werewolf fan. My friend Keith is a vampire fan. So it's like the Capulets and the Montagues with us. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of vampire movies that I do love. It's just that I'm drawn a little more towards werewolf movies, and we'll get into that in a minute. I will admit full-heartedly that there are a lot more good vampire movies than there are good werewolf movies. But the reason for that is, you balance the two out, there are a lot more vampire movies in general than there are werewolf movies. I would say I could be wrong about this, but for every one werewolf movie, there are at least 5, maybe even 10 vampire movies. Vampires have been popular for a very long time, and I think there are certain reasons why so many people gravitate towards vampire movies. And the first reason I'm half kidding about, half kidding, half serious. Vampires are sexy. You really stop and think about it. Vampires... How do I say this without sounding like a sick pervert? There really is no way, so I'm just going to go for it here. There is an eroticism when it comes to vampires. Like this undead creature, pale skin with fangs, that drinks blood, basically, bites you on the neck. There's always something about nibbling on the neck. There are a lot of people who like neck nibbling, and that kind of turns them on, Think about it. When you're getting frisky with your significant other, how many times is neck nibbling involved? Forgive me for getting too personal here, but hey, I don't mean anything by it. But anyway, no, but seriously, there is a sensual nature to the vampire. There's more of a... The creature has been romanticized so much over the years. You think about it, the original incarnation, the original vampire, you had Dracula. You had Bram Stoker's original novel. When it comes to vampires, there's a classiness to them, and again, there is a sensual nature to them, a romantic nature to them. Because most vampires, especially in the early days of fiction and film, they were very proper creatures. They were very, well-dressed. When you think a vampire, the first vampire that pops into your mind is Dracula. And when you think Dracula, that first image that pops into your head, somebody with, well-dressed in that cape and, piercing eyes. It's usually the Bela Lugosi Dracula that pops into your head, somebody very clean-cut and dapper. Sex and vampires have gone together quite a bit. In the 1930s, okay, they couldn't get that in with vampires, but as they went into the 50s with the Hammer films, sexuality became a bigger part of the vampire lore. You saw more skin, maybe not full-blown nudity, but you would see some cleavage and maybe some arms here and there. And then, you'd get to the 60s, and, vampires would become a little more sexy. In the 70s, you got the lesbian vampire movies, and I don't think I need to tell you why those movies were kind of sensual. But again, sex has always been a big part of vampire lore, and it's grown even more so over time. Most vampire movies are essentially love stories. You look at the original Dracula, and then you look at Bram Stoker's Dracula, how that was turned into sort of a romance. There's romance in every horror movie, of course, but vampire flicks focus more on the romance a little more, and I think that's why a lot more people are able to gravitate towards vampires. Let's say you have someone who's not really a slasher fan, they can gravitate towards the vampire movies because of that other elements there. And because every vampire movie has some kind of love story in it. Maybe not every one of them, but I would say most of them. I like 90% at least involve some kind of romance between a human and a vampire, or two vampires, or something along those lines. The other reason why I think there are more vampire movies than werewolf movies, and I don't mean this as an insult, vampire movies are kinda easier to make, depending on what story you tell. Because vampires mostly look human. I mean, yes, they can turn into bats sometimes, they can turn into wolves sometimes, just like werewolves, they can turn into mist. But most of the time, a vampire looks mostly human. And when a vampire is changed to look somewhat inhuman, it's slight disfigurements to the face to make it look kind of more bat-like. But most of the time, a vampire looks human. And that's kind of easier to make than someone who's covered with hair and elongated face and looks very wolf-like. So, naturally, when a movie is easier to make, you're going to get more of that particular genre. Again, look at the slasher films. Those are probably the easiest horror movies to make. Group of people getting stalked by a masked killer. Hence why we got so many of those in the 80s. And we still get those nowadays. It's a very simple formula to make. Not saying that making those kind of films can't get complicated. They can. And not saying you can't add more to a vampire movie. You can. But in the long run, yeah, okay, it's easier to make a human-looking monster than a wolf-looking monster when it comes to film. Not so much nowadays because of CGI, but hey, if your monster looks like a human, you don't need all the CGI to make that person look like a monster. The main complication when making a werewolf movie is you need a transformation. The transformation is a huge part of werewolf movies. When someone turns into a vampire, like let's say someone gets bitten on the neck and becomes a vampire, they get long teeth, maybe paler skin, maybe longer fingernails. You can go all out with it, like the vampires in Blade 2. I mean, those are crazy-looking vampires. Or the vampires in Daybreakers, when the vampires don't drink blood and become these inhuman bat-like creatures. Or especially, like, the vampires in From Dusk Till Dawn. I mean, you can have crazy-looking vampires if you want to, but most of the time you get the more human-looking ones. In a werewolf movie, like, you need to make the monster look like a wolf when that transformation comes. You can use CGI, but whether you use CGI or practical effects, which I prefer, I will always prefer practical effects, you gotta go show something. I mean, you gotta go all out with the transformation. You have to make it in a way so that you believe that it's a person turning into a wolf. If you stiff people on the transformation, people are going to feel let down, because the transformation is, like, it can be the biggest part of a werewolf movie. You have some amazing vampire flicks out there. I mean, Let the Right One In was great. The 2009 Korean Thirst by Park Chang-wook, I still don't know how to pronounce that, I apologize. Both fantastic vampire films. You have the early Dracula films. You have the Hammer Dracula films. Hell, Hammer vampire films that aren't related to Dracula are fantastic. One of the things that started making me lean more towards werewolves was because I did start getting rather vampired out. Let's focus on vampires for a second here. I mean, there are a lot of great vampire movies, but there have been so many that people don't do too much new with them nowadays. I mean, you get a vampire story, so many times they do stuff that we've seen before. You know, vampires need to drink blood. Well, we've seen that before. Vampires can't go in the sunlight or they'll die. We've seen that before. Vampire falls in love with human. Again, majority of vampire movies are about that. I'm not saying you don't have the cliched werewolf movies, because you do, but I think because there are less werewolf movies, the novelty doesn't wear off. Whereas with vampire movies, we've gotten so many of them, and people do so little new with vampire movies. It just kind of started wearing me down after a while. It's the same thing with zombie movies. I got very zombied out when the zombie boom happened. I will still watch vampire movies and zombie movies if I'm interested in them, but because we've been bombarded with so much, I've just kind of gotten sick of them after a while. That doesn't mean I won't come across another vampire movie that I love. There have been plenty of post-2000 vampire movies that I have loved. It's just the majority of them that I've seen, I think they're fine. And another thing that kind of turned me off to vampire movies, the thing that, started getting me to lean closer towards werewolf movies, were people that I like to call the vampire snobs. Every fan base has those fans that say, these movies have to be a specific way, and they can't be any other way. And those fans are... I know I'm going to piss off a lot of people, but those fans are the problem with movies today. Not every fan is these people when it comes to certain franchises and genres. Not every fan... The majority of fans are great people. It's the minority that can ruin fan bases for other people. The problem is that very small group just so happens to be the loudest group. So many genres and franchises have suffered from this. Look at the Halloween franchise. This has been happening since the dawn of film. Like the Halloween franchise, we had Halloween 1 and 2, and then we had Halloween 3, which is a great movie, but had nothing to do with Michael Myers. They wanted to go in a different direction. Everybody complained about it. I'll admit, when I was in high school, I was one of those people who complained. But then I started giving the movie a chance, and now it's one of my favorite movies in the series. But, people complained because they didn't get Michael Myers. It didn't do the same thing. So they went back to Michael Myers in the fourth film. Then they made it seem like Jamie Lloyd was going to be the new killer in the rest of the series. I apologize for spoilers for Part 4, but please forgive me. So, it looked like Jamie Lloyd was going to be the killer in the Halloween series after Part 4. People didn't want that. They wanted Michael Myers. And so that series went on and burned itself out because they kept doing essentially the same thing in every movie. Same thing with the Friday the 13th franchise. Jason was killed in Friday the 13th Part 4. And again, I apologize if you haven't seen the series. Spoilers for the series. You looked at Part 5, we didn't get Jason in Part 5. And then it looked like Tommy Doyle was going to be the killer for the rest of that series. People didn't want that. They wanted Jason back, so we got Jason back. As much as people love those series, you have the people who insist that the movies have to be a specific way, and because of that, we don't get anything new. We get the same thing over and over and over again, and then it becomes stale. Again, going back to the slasher genre, there was the slasher boom, and people wanted slashers to be a specific way, and then we got so many slasher movies, the genre became stale, and so the slasher craze ended towards the late 80s. That's the same thing that started making vampire movies stale for me. You had the vampire purist who said that vampires had to be a specific way. Here's a perfect example of that. I used to work at a movie theater when I was younger. I loved talking movies with the people that I worked with, Some of them weren't horror fans, some of them were. But, I mean, I just liked talking about movies. And I told a couple of them about this idea I had. This idea for a horror movie combining, like, Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Hills Have Eyes meets a vampire movie. A group of people stumble in the backwoods and kind of deal with these inbred vampires. They're like these inbred hillbilly vampires. And no joke, these two people that I was working with, they looked at me and they said, "You can't do that." I said, "Well, I like that idea, and I would like to, maybe write a script for it. I'm not saying I could film it, but I would like to write something down for it." He said, "No, you can't do that." "Why can't I do that?" "Well, because vampires can't be rednecks." "Sure they can. Anybody can be a redneck if they want to be. You can be whatever you want to be. If you believe, you can make it happen." So I started saying, "Why can't I do that?" It's like, "Well, because Anne Rice says that's not how vampires work." "What do you mean that's not how vampires work?" Mind you, I never read any Anne Rice vampire novels. I was curious to. I had not seen Interview with a Vampire yet. They said Anne Rice says that's not how vampires can be. "Why can't vampires be like that?" He's like, "Well, vampires only turn people who are of noble blood." "Who says?" "Well, Anne Rice." "So what if Anne Rice says that? I want to make this redneck vampire story." So "No, you can't make the redneck vampire story." They kept telling me I was not allowed to do this because vampires can only be this one specific way. And it got into this stupid debate about me not being allowed to make or write a story about inbred redneck vampires. Because they kept insisting that vampires can only be of noble blood, and they'll only turn people of noble blood because that's how Anne Rice says vampires need to be. Clearly, they have never seen From Dusk Till Dawn, where the vampires are strippers, but hey, maybe they were noble strippers. So that dumb conversation started to sour me to vampire movies. I mean, don't get me wrong, I de-soured, and I started enjoying the vampire movies, but again, I've noticed, there are a lot of vampire movies that are very much alike other vampire movies. Now, I'll admit that's hypocritical coming from me, who is a fan of slasher movies, because, let's face it, slasher movies are very much alike other slasher movies. So many movies in the genre are very similar to each other. And I'll admit that that there is some hypocrisy there. But here's me trying to defend myself. Slasher movies revel in cliches. They are very aware that each one has these cliches in them, and they celebrate it in many ways. You do have plenty of slasher movies that are different from others, and I will always go into a slasher movie hoping for something new and different. But that's a conversation for another time, so let's go back to me being a hypocrite about vampire movies. I still watch and enjoy plenty of vampire movies. I love Dracula, I love Nosferatu, I love the Hammer Dracula series. My favorite vampire movie of all time is Near Dark. I think that one is fantastic. Both of the Thirst movies, the South Korean 2009 Thirst and the Australian 1979 Thirst, I've done reviews of both of them, so I will put that up here somewhere. Me shamelessly whoring myself out. I really love those two. Those are some fantastic vampire movies. Let the Right One In, of course. That one's great. Daybreakers from... That came out in 2010, right? 2009 or 2010. But anyway, Daybreakers. That is a fantastic vampire movie. Because I love the idea of Daybreakers. If you haven't seen Daybreakers, it's essentially taking place in the not-too-distant future of 2009, where there was essentially a vampire apocalypse. Now, if you remember 2019, the not-too-distant future of 2019, if you remember 2019, that vampire apocalypse was a real pain in the ass, wasn't it? Anyway, so the world has been overtaken with vampires. You know, this vampiric disease came out and vampirism spread throughout the population. There's only a small percentage of humans left. And we basically see a functioning vampire society. And I found that fascinating. So Daybreakers has become one of my favorite vampire movies. It's at least in the top 3. I mean, Near Dark will always be number 1. I absolutely love Near Dark. But Daybreakers, you know, showing a functioning vampire society, or a functioning vampire society that's on the verge of collapse because there's a shortage of human blood, because the most of the people in the world are vampires. And, you know, there's a thing where vampires can't drink vampire blood, and there's a whole thing in that. But seeing a functioning vampire society was so fascinating and so different from other vampire movies. We hadn't seen that before in other vampire movies. It's just like, you know, I love when slasher movies do something different. I love when vampire movies do something different. I love when zombie movies do something different. You know, I mean, the way the George Romero movies were going, you had Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, and then you had Land of the Dead. And, you know, in Day of the Dead, the zombies had evolved slightly, and then in Land of the Dead, the zombies evolved even more. Then he stopped that, and he basically restarted the series with Diary of the Dead and Survival of the Dead. I think that's what it was called. But I wish he continued with that. That's a zombie movie that I would love to see. A functioning zombie society. Like, where the zombies developed some form of intelligence and are kind of acting like normal people now. Kind of like Daybreakers, but with zombies. I'd love to see that. But anyway, going back to Daybreakers, it's so well done, and it has Willem Dafoe, which bumps it up for me. I love Willem Dafoe. He's one of my favorite actors. Whether you're a vampire fan, if you're vampired out like me, or you're a diehard vampire fan, you know, go check out go check out vampire movies that aren't like other vampire movies. Like Near Dark, I absolutely love Near Dark. Like I said, it's my favorite vampire movie because it's more of a vampire western. And one of the things I love about that is they never use the word vampire in the movie. And they don't have fangs like typical vampires. They are killed by sunlight, like many vampires are. But, you know, going from vampires to werewolves, because I said I am a werewolf fan. I mean, you put me on the side of the aisle, I'm on the werewolf side of the aisle. The reason I love werewolf movies, and the reason I like them more than vampire movies, one, I'm a dog person. Just kidding. That's not a real reason. One of the things that puts werewolf movies over vampire movies for me is that in werewolf movies, it's harder to hide the monster. Like, okay, vampires, like in most vampire movies, as I mentioned before, the vampires look human. You know, I mean, they do have fangs, but they can always keep their mouths closed. But, like, if a vampire is walking around at night, no one's going to give them a second look. Whereas with werewolves, yes, they're a normal person until the full moon comes out. And then once the full moon comes out, they're, you know, completely lose control. They turn into this big wolf-like creature. Not something you can easily hide. I mean, yeah, okay, a werewolf can, you know, deter people from thinking that he or she is a wolf person. But once, you know, you become a werewolf, it's kind of hard to hide that. And I find that fascinating. Werewolves are a little more tragic than vampires, to me. I mean, vampires can be tragic because they're living forever. They can outlive their, you know, like if they fall in love with a person that they don't want to bite, they can outlive that person. But for me, it's not as tragic as with werewolves. There probably are some exceptions, yes. There are some exceptions, but in most werewolf stories, once you become the werewolf, you have completely lost control. You have lost control to the monster. And to me, that's a little more tragic, and it creates this sense of dread because, that person knows that when the full moon comes out, they're gonna turn into a werewolf, and that to me is so terrifying. There are, of course, some werewolf movies where that is an exception. Like, a werewolf can turn... There are some werewolf movies where the werewolf can turn whenever. There are some werewolf movies where it doesn't matter what moon it is, the person is going to turn into a werewolf. I like when these movies toy around with these ideas, and it doesn't matter to me what kind of werewolf it is, as long as it's a decent story. But I will admit, I do prefer the werewolf movies where there is a slight sense of dread for the person who's going to become a werewolf. And the other reason I think I gravitate more towards werewolf movies is because one of my favorite subgenres in horror is body horror. Like David Cronenberg's The Fly or Society, Videodrome. God, I love Videodrome. You know what body horror is. It's horror of the body. Like, something's wrong with your body. Like, your body transforms into this different way. Werewolves, in many ways, are the first form of body horror. Think about it. Body horror is all about someone's body mutating in a strange way, becoming deformed in this abnormal, alien way. Admittedly, a wolf isn't as alien as something like The Thing, from John Carpenter's The Thing, but it is body horror. It's someone's body transforming into something else, And that really is one of the main reasons why I gravitate towards werewolf movies. I don't know if other people think this way, but I've always categorized werewolf movies in the body horror genre. So, like, when I say body horror is one of my favorite horror genres, I do lump werewolf movies with that because of the transformations, because it's a person it's someone's body turning from a human body to a wolf body or a wolf-like creature. So in many ways, you could say that the Wolfman, the original 1940s Wolfman, is one of the first body horror movies. I love the tragedy in a lot of these werewolf movies. It's, like I said, it's beyond the victim's control. They are going to transform into a monster, and that really just works for me. Plus, when it comes to monsters, I like monsters that look less human. Like, vampires, like I said, there are plenty of vampire movies I love. But when it comes to monsters, I prefer the more inhuman monsters. Like Pumpkinhead, he's a perfect example of a monster I love. The Blob, that's really an inhuman-looking monster. The Xenomorph from Alien. I love creatures like that. And that's why I love werewolf movies, a person transforming into something that barely resembles human. It depends on, the movie, because some werewolf movies, you get the wolves that walk on all fours, and in others, you get the bipedal werewolves. I think both work. It's just this fascination I've had with werewolves for a while, and for a while I was on the fence on whether I liked vampires or werewolves. When it comes to werewolf movies, the one that is considered the creme de la creme is, of course, An American Werewolf in London, which is fantastic. The transformation scene in American Werewolf in London is one of the best examples of practical effects in horror. In any movie, really. When I think practical effects, like many people would say The Thing and American Werewolf in London, those are just such amazing scenes. I love the look of the werewolf in American Werewolf in London. Like, again, it's I think it walks on all fours. They never show it too much in the movie. Like, you get quick glimpses of it here and there. but it literally looks like a wolf monster. You know, like those sharp teeth, you know. The simple design of the... I think that's another reason why I love werewolf movies so much. Like, vampire movies are, you know, same with why I think vampire movies are so popular. The designs of the monsters are simple and appealing. I always think simple is the best way to go, whether it comes to the story in your horror movie or the design of your creature. I mean, vampires are very simple. It's mostly a person. With werewolves, you know, it's mostly like some kind of wolf-looking creature. With werewolves, it's just, you look at a design of a werewolf, and if you do it right, it's instantly appealing because it's so familiar. And the design of the werewolf in American Werewolf in London is so good. The whole story of, you know, David, you know, getting attacked by the werewolf, seeing his friend Jack get torn up by that werewolf. One of the best kills in horror, it really is. It's such a brutal attack. It looks like a vicious animal attack. And of course, you know, how David, you know, does what anybody would do in that situation. He runs. He runs. And the guilt he feels throughout the movie, having Jack, you know, now an undead spirit, constantly coming back and visiting David, there's this great mix of humor and horror. It's just the dynamic between David and Jack during all of these scenes, the banter they have back and forth, it's so good. But as much as I love American Werewolf in London, that's not my favorite werewolf movie. My favorite werewolf movie is The Howling. Dee Wallace going to a colony of werewolves. I love that movie so damn much. Joe Dante as the director, you know, I mean, he's not only directed my favorite werewolf movie, he directed one of my favorite killer animal flicks, Piranha, which is my favorite killer animal flick after Jaws. And then, of course, one of my favorite sci-fi movies, Inner Space. Joe Dante doesn't get enough credit as a director. Everybody talks about Gremlins, and a lot of people talk about The Howling, but he's done a lot of great movies. The Howling, definitely my favorite movie by him, and like I said, my favorite werewolf movie. And the reason I like it more than American Werewolf in London is because an American Werewolf in London, as great of a movie as it is your typical werewolf story. You know, person gets attacked by a werewolf, is told that they're going to become a monster, and then when the full moon comes out, they become a monster. It tells the story very well, and it does its own spin on the werewolf story. Great movie, but it is your typical werewolf story, whereas with The Howling, you have Dee Wallace, who's this reporter who, you know, helps this sting operation to catch this stalker. And you know, after that, it's a traumatic event, so her and her husband, they're having trouble in their marriage, so they go to this retreat, which is this, like, couples retreat, where people go to try to rebuild their relationship, and you find out that it's a colony of werewolves. And what I love about The Howling is, in most werewolf movies, the werewolf is the victim. You look at the Wolfman, he is the victim of this whole thing. An American Werewolf in London, he is the victim of this whole thing. Ginger Snaps, Ginger is the victim in many ways. But in The Howling, the werewolves here are the villains. They are clearly the bad guys. And I love the designs of these werewolves, too. It's another one of those situations where it's instantly appealing. And I do like the bipedal werewolves. You know, an American Werewolf in London does have the better transformation, but the transformation in The Howling is really good, too. I would say The Howling has the second best transformations in werewolf movies, and that's because Rick Baker, when he was working on The Howling before he did an American Werewolf in London, But then he dropped out to work on American Werewolf in London, and then Rob Bottin took over for him. Rob Bottin, the same guy who did the effects work for The Thing. I love the story in The Howling. I love the characters in The Howling. Dee Wallace in The Howling. Such a good performance. Dee Wallace is a fantastic scream queen. You know, she was great in The Howling. She was great in The Hills Have Eyes. She was great in Cujo. Dee Wallace's best performance, in terms of horror at least, I think it's between The Howling and Cujo. I mean, those are two great performances. And, of course, in both movies, she's fighting canines. No, but again, her character, she's so vulnerable in this situation. The Howling has my favorite ending, not just in a werewolf movie, but one of my favorite endings in a horror movie. So tragic and so funny at the same time. I mean, oh my god, I don't want to spoil that for you if you haven't seen it. Yeah, but The Howling just stands out as one of my favorite werewolf movies of all time. And, An American Werewolf in London, also great. Ginger Snaps, that is a fantastic werewolf movie. God, I love Ginger Snaps because of how it's the metaphor. Because Ginger in that movie, she's having her first period, so she's not only becoming a werewolf, she's becoming a woman. And that's one of the werewolf movies where, sex is a big... There is a good amount of sex in werewolf movies, too. I mean, but I think with werewolf movies, unlike in vampire movies, like the sex in vampire movies, it's more of a, very lustful and steamy, whereas the sex in werewolf movies is wild and dirty. It really is. No, but, Ginger Snaps, I mean, the idea of these two sisters, one of them becomes a werewolf, and, the other starts becoming a woman and leaving the other one behind as she's turning into a werewolf. Catherine Isabel is fantastic in that movie as Ginger. I mean, she is so good in that movie. But Emily Perkins, who plays Bridget, I don't think she gets enough credit for this movie, because she does a good job, too, at playing Bridget, playing the little sister who's desperately trying to save her older sister from becoming this monster, but she's becoming out of, Ginger, she's going out of control because of the fact that she's turning into this monster. And Ginger Snaps has another very good transformation in terms of werewolf movies, and it's so different because, unlike in most werewolf movies where it happens all at once, the transformation in Ginger Snaps, unlike most werewolf movies where it happens all at once, this one happens gradually. As Ginger gets closer and closer to the full moon, she starts growing a tail out of her ass, her fingernails start growing longer, her eyes start changing, she starts growing fangs. It's a gradual transformation as we get closer and closer to the full moon. So well done. Ginger Snaps is great. Dog Soldiers is a very good and very underrated werewolf movie. It's by the same guy who did The Descent, and you have these soldiers, they're doing this war exercise, and then they run into a group of werewolves, so they have to hold up in this cabin and fend the werewolves off. Very Night of the Living Dead-esque scenario, but the wolves in that movie look so good, and the acting, it's very funny and scary at the same time, and very suspenseful. All the characters, they do a good job. The characters feel like they are a squad that has worked together for a very long time. They feel like a group that really knows each other, and they bounce off each other so well, so when they finally start getting killed off, it's terrible. Well, not terrible, it's great, but, you don't want to see them die. Very well done. You got so many good werewolf movies that not a lot of people talk about. Bad Moon from 1996. That is it's not a perfect werewolf movie, but it is a very well done one. And the reason I like Bad Moon is because, one, it has Michael Perry, or Michael Pear, or Michael Pere. I'm not sure. His last name is spelled P-A-R-E, and the E has an accent over it. but we'll call him Michael Pear for now. Michael Pear is in that movie. Now, if you don't know who Michael Pear is, Michael Pear starred in Streets of Fire. And if you haven't seen Streets of Fire, shame on you. It's by the same director who did The Warriors, and it's such a fun movie. It's a rock and roll fable. You really should check that out. But anyway, I love Bad Moon, not just because it has Michael Pear, but it has a great werewolf design. And the thing that helps this stand out is that one of the main characters of this movie is Thor, the German Shepherd. I love German Shepherds. They're my favorite dog. I love German Shepherds and Corgis, because Corgis look like you took your German Shepherd to the dry cleaners and they shrunk it. Anyway, tangent. I love German Shepherds, and I love how in this horror movie, the dog is one of the main characters. Because usually in a horror movie, dogs don't last long. You see a dog in a horror movie, there's a very good chance it's going to get killed. The dog in Bad Moon, again, is one of the main characters. He's the one who figures out what's going on. And it's one of the best dog actors I've ever seen. And so I find it fascinating how we're seeing things through the eyes of the dog so many times. And it's funny because it has the kid from the 90s, Dennis the Menace, in that movie. And that's one of the things the movie has working against it, because I see that kid, I think Dennis the Menace. It's just, I see him, I was like, yeah, you're Dennis the Menace. I can't take you seriously. Anyway, I've rambled on for long enough, I think. Vampire or werewolf or anything in between. I mean, we live in a world where we can have both. I mean, I get why people love vampire movies so much. I get why people love werewolf movies so much. I will always be on the werewolf side, but I'm always gonna love vampire movies too. Even though I'm vampired out, I'm always interested in what the genre is going to bring us. And I do hope we get more werewolf movies in the future. I mean, I don't want the genre to become so bloated that I become tired of it, but I do want to see some more werewolf movies. I want to see werewolves get more love. I mean, because, yeah, vampire movies are more popular than werewolves, and I get that, but being on the werewolf side, I want to see werewolves get more love. I really do. So, I hope you enjoyed this little dive into my enjoyment of werewolf movies and my enjoyment of vampire movies. I apologize, as always, if this has been a little rambly. But, hey, on that note, as always, I want to thank all of you for supporting this channel. Thank you so much. I mean, everybody, all the comments have been, very positive towards this stuff, and I'm very grateful for that. I'm very grateful. I recently got over 38,000 subscribers, so thank you so much for that. I mean, it's all because of you guys supporting me. Thank you to old subscribers who have come back. Thank you to the new subscribers who have come back. I hope you're all, staying well and safe during this weird time. For now, leave a comment down below. Let me know, are you on the vampire side? Are you on the werewolf side? What are some of your favorite movies in each genre? Let me know some werewolf movies that not a lot of people have heard of, because I do want to, check out some more werewolf movies. And, hey, if you're a vampire fan and if you know of some vampire movies that not a lot of people are talking about, mention them down below in the comments. But until then, again, thank you as always, and this is the Maniac here to remind you that the Grindhouse will never die.